So welcome to this week's episode of Leaders on a Mission, where I'm joined by inspiring leaders driven by the impact of creating a healthy and sustainable world. Now, in today's episode, I'm joined by alternative protein enthusiast, David Bucca, CEO and founder of Change Foods, a food tech startup using microbial technologies to really define food products. And David, listen, thanks for coming on the show today. It's great to speak to you and have you on.
Thank you so much, Simon. Pleased to be here.
Excellent. So let's take it all the way back. I'm really interested, just more in the early upbringing and some of the kind of, I suppose, the key forces that really help shape some of your, I suppose, big influences in life, as it were.
Big question. Well, I'm an Italian Australian. My parents are both Italian, born in Melbourne, Australia, and really grew up, I think, in a world of food. My mum's a great cook. My parents both had cafes and restaurants and delicatessens and international food stores and things like that, all my upbringing in life. So food's always been, first of all, very pivotal to me personally. Grew up as sort of the youngest of 4 children, but the youngest by 13 years. So I think I was a mistake, most definitely. But nonetheless, grew up, had a really great upbringing and very family oriented, as a lot of Italian families are. And funnily enough, it was, really motivated by both the arts and the sciences. So they used to call me the Renaissance man at Boeing, just because, I really had that proclivity to really understand, love music, culture, the arts, history, but also the hard sciences, engineering and, just mathematics, design, innovation, and using sort of technology for those purposes. So that's sort of really ultimately what led me to really have a lot of interests, I guess, in many different spheres and arenas. And sort of when I came to the point of university, I was going to choose whether or not I wanted to pursue a career in playing the piano and music, or I was going to get into aerospace engineering, right? There was this crazy sort of, very different polarity, but I've always felt I could do music as a passion and a hobby. And I wasn't good enough, I don't think, as a pianist to actually make a career or anything valuable out of it. But I could see how I could certainly get involved in the aerospace world, which always fascinated me. I've always been fascinated with big ideas and things like space exploration as a kid, and I always knew that I wanted to sort of get into that field at some point. So yeah, started a big double degree course in aerospace engineering and aviation, got my commercial pilot license, and was really, stepped into the industry, working for Boeing predominantly in Melbourne for over 14 years in many different functions. And really loved the space, loved the industry, loved the company. It just has everything you could possibly imagine in terms of a career progression, and started in engineering, ended up in manufacturing and quality assurance, traveled a lot, and really just loved that sector. And it was a big shock to me about 7 or 6 years ago when I actually changed and left that industry completely, where I thought I would probably carve out my life career, into switch into the alternative food space. So
really, well, I mean, tell me, what it must be that one moment, basically, which kind of pivotal moment where that change happened, as it were. Can you, because it's aerospace into I suppose sustainable food innovation. What happened?
It's a big switch. It's a big switch, and I get asked this question a lot, obviously. People are fascinated by it, but it really was a personal choice, first of all. It started from within. I was really exploring and looking at where I was with my career, and what motivated me the most. And I was very exploratory, had an open mind, was meeting and reading a lot, doing a lot of introspection, talking with a lot of people and learning a lot. So first of all, my mind was open. And I always loved food. I actually started a cafe chain with my ex-wife back, about 12 years ago, I think it was. And so really sort of have always been entrepreneurial, always loved that entrepreneurial spirit and drive. Even when I was working within, a corporate job, I still loved the idea of starting and doing my own thing, first of all. I've always had that spirit and passion within me to do something, greater. And I think really when I started learning about food, and I met some great influential people, one of them was Thomas King, and he was a fantastic young aspiring sort of visionary in Melbourne, Australia, who knew a lot about the food industry and sort of planted the seeds, if you like, that then I took and read a lot and researched a lot and realized, holy moly, the gap that I had, the cognitive dissonance that I had in my understanding of how food is truly produced was quite shocking. Like here I am, very educated, loving food, grown up with food, but still detached from really the impacts of food. And more so as an engineer, I'm putting the engineering lens over it, like how inefficient food is being produced. And when I learned about the statistics of food production, the systems, and then looked at, on the other hand, the rising demand of protein, predominantly over the next 20 to 30 years, mainly out of Asia and Africa, actually, it really shocked me to say that it's not, we don't have a solution for that. It's not going to work. Or if we do continue expanding the current inefficiencies of our current food supply, something is going to give quite, disastrously. And having two children, I could sort of mapped out their future and sort of said, wow, this is going to be a really tough, interesting challenge to solve. But more so with my systematic mind, I could see how technology is absolutely going to play a vital, critical role in solving that. So it was really like this information overload, connecting all the dots, and ultimately led to me to change my own personal diet. I actually became plant-based overnight. Actually, I was making a bolognese, switched out the meat, put in lentils and mushrooms, haven't eaten lentil. 2016, I'd say.
Right.
And it was really, I was like, look, I'm going to just try this out for a few weeks and months. And it was a big shock to my friends and family, like having, eaten a lot of meat and dairy as an Italian sort of growing up, and I would have been the last person who would have thought would have gone plant-based. But I tried it and I was sleeping better. I had more energy. I was learning a lot. It was more aligned with actually what I believed in, because I could say, well, now I can actually choose. My buying power actually has an influence, and it was more aligned with actually my values and my newfound sort of motivation to help solve this problem. So it was just, I never looked back. And it was really that pivotal moment of, wow, stars aligned. Suddenly aerospace actually felt insignificant almost to the issues that I discovered that we have to contend with globally, and how I could actually play a role in that space. And it just opened up, a path opened up, and I never looked back. I started a not-for-profit organization called Food Frontier with Thomas King, actually, who I mentioned earlier. And that was really critical because we didn't really have an ecosystem in Australia at the time. So it allowed me to learn, first of all, about all the technologies and structurally think of, well, how do we create a whole ecosystem in this space, to start shifting people's paradigms, to make them understand how food is produced, first of all, on the advocacy end, but more so on the structural end. How do we actually create an ecosystem? How do we get investment? How do we create an ecosystem for new and budding entrepreneurs to get them excited about the opportunities in this space? How do we then get regulators on side? How do we think about export? How do we create a new industry for Australia? Manufacturing is such a passionate field for me, and I could see the decline in automotive engineering and manufacturing in Australia, often losing it to the likes of Asia just because of labor costs. And manufacturing is such a critical, sustainable life force for any budding economy. And so, what next? Where is this going to go? Really, why aerospace ended up remaining within Australia is because it's high R&D, it's high technology. And I think that's ultimately where we needed to sort of move in the direction of bringing in more advanced technologies. And so I could see there was also a fit of this emerging sector fitting into that as a sort of economic need in the region. So I think that was really pivotal, because it just helped me structurally think about the problem for many years and meet a lot of companies and learn a lot about different technologies and sort of really figure out the landscape, which has been very pivotal in my thinking, I guess.
Yeah. Tell me how it is, because I mean, look, most of the stuff I look at is in Europe and the US. I mean, tell me from I suppose, Australian ecosystem, what does that look like now in terms of this world, as it were?
Well, the term plant-based, I'm pretty sure didn't exist in 2017. So that tells you how far the industry has come. I believe there was maybe only a couple of more incumbent sort of plant-based companies in Australia, but not 100% plant-based. They often had a portfolio of products and happened to have plant-based products, like the likes of Sanitarium and so forth. And so really the ecosystem was zero, if you like. A lot of it was imported in terms of purely plant-based products. There were some great distributors at the time doing, getting hold of whatever they could and trying to get it into supermarkets, purely for a vegan and vegetarian consumer market, which is very small. And now, of course, I think there's around 30 companies, if I recall, 8 of them of which are cell-based companies. There's a lot of now new companies in everything from, agri-tech, agriculture, precision agriculture, right through to plant-based, cell-based, and of course fermentation. So it really has come a long way, far quicker than I could ever imagine. I remember speaking with Thomas one day saying, "Can you imagine when the iconic Australian 4 and 20 meat pie, there's a vegan version of that one day, or a plant-based version?" And it just felt like such a lofty objective, which I could see 5 or 10 years down the road, right? And I think that would be a big iconic moment. It literally happened within 2 years. There was a plant. Yeah, I mean, it just shocked me. I was like, wow, this obviously, people could see the opportunity and could see that this is a rising trend, I think, first and foremost, and purely from how do larger companies get involved. And I think we need lots of solutions across the spectrum, from startups, or even with the large food companies, because that's really where we're going to drive to the systemic change that we're looking for. So that was really exciting.
Got it. No, just even thinking back right to that moment where you made that decision yourself to, that literally, that was it, and there was no going back. And tell me, was it purely based on, the climate, the effects on, animal agriculture in the environment, or was that really the main reason why you just lit?
That was absolutely part of the solution, but whichever lens you look at this problem through, it can solve for a lot of different issues. One of which is, how do we create more sustainable food, and how do we minimize climate impact? Absolutely. I mean, that's core. But for me as well, it was really just the plight for animals and I guess the suffering in the system, which was really abhorrent when I learned more and more and more about it, from dairy through chicken farming through, pigs and cattle. I mean, it's really, I just couldn't believe how industrialized and draconian we've made this process. So much so that, of course, animal welfare is continuing to improve, I guess, in small evolutionary steps. But where we've brought it to is really just, how do we squeeze more and more out of the animal? And of course, that's never going to be good for the poor animal. And so I think that was really, I guess, for me personally, I think that was one of the main motivating factors, really, is just that we've got to stop exploiting something and being so naive about just, I guess, consumption, really. I've got this mantra, which is creation over consumption, which I always run through my mind. I mean, we've got to stop consuming media, consuming products, and just expanding. I mean, meat consumption continues to expand, health issues continue to rise, and it's all the result of lifestyle choices and overconsumption. We've got problems of excess now, not problems of deficiency. So that whole thing really motivated me, and I thought, like, gosh, we've got to stop treating the earth so poorly. We've got to stop treating animals so poorly just for our own benefit, and this life of excess and consumption. And I think just that disgust of that tipping point sort of was like, we've got to change this. We don't need an animal. We can actually produce far more superior protein from plants. The plants go through the animal. The animal is a processing aid of conversion of feedstock into finished calories. And mind you, very inefficiently. So it takes 25 to 30 calories of input to get 1 calorie of output for beef. The most efficient animal is a chicken, which is around 8 calories, or 8 to 9 calories to 1. And that's just ridiculous when we can just take the plants and convert them with a much more fitting protein, much more complete protein in many parts, and skip that animal and redistribute the food to people that need it. So, it's ultimately a redistribution problem. We're producing enough calorific output from the land globally, easily to feed ourselves and keep everyone happy and to end global hunger. But 60% of crop feed is going to feedstock for animals, which can only ultimately feed 10 to 20% of the population that can afford it. So it's ultimately a redistribution problem. So it doesn't matter which way you come at it. Like every angle I looked at it, was like, gosh, this has just got to change, and then the whole health crisis, which I won't even get into, but that's a whole nother discussion as well.
Well, just touch upon that, the health crisis with too much kind of over consumption of meat, as it were, or?
Well, I think it just, there's a lot of historical data to support the fact that as you have a growing economy, and people have, rising GDP, if you like. I guess that's probably one of the best indicators that you see a comparative and a linear relationship with the rise in meat consumption and meat and dairy consumption. And of course, with then the prevalence of then lifestyle diseases that come along with that. So cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, you name it. And there is a definite correlation with the increase of meat and dairy consumption and animal products with those health issues, of course, which are now the three biggest killers in the West. These problems didn't exist 100 years ago. People always say, the paleo diet, we've got to go back to the cavemans. No, we don't. We're just going to go back 150 years to what our great-grandparents ate and look at how they lived. They didn't have these issues of excess and overconsumption of meat. Meat was a luxury. It was a luxury item. They had it maybe a couple of times a week. It was a celebrated food. It was valued and it was respected more so than it is on the plate. Whereas now it's just a commoditized protein source that almost has to make it on every single meal. And where did that transition happen and why? And now it's unfortunate to see, the likes of Asia, who have historically had one of the healthiest diets, getting more affluence, getting a middle class. And now, of course, we're having that same historical trend of increasing meat and dairy, which is so unfortunate. And that's why, fast forward 20 years, we're going to have a tremendous issue with trying to supply that demand of protein because of just the sheer population and the growing middle class. And of course, we're already using a third of arable land for agriculture. So where is it going to come from?
It is messed up. David, you mentioned about the entrepreneurial kind of building out the kind of ecosystem. How did that lead on to just tell me the story about how it led on to you kind of founding kind of Change Foods?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, I helped start a food frontier with Thomas. So we launched that. I'm still a board member today, actually, but that was a good foray into the space, I guess, and sort of opened up the opportunity to learn once again about the technologies and meet a lot of companies and look at the gaps in the market. That's what really interested me, is sort of where is this heading? Where is this going to go? And sit back a little bit, don't rush into anything, but sort of just observe and learn. And I think that's just how I am. But once I make my mind on something, I go at it 150%. But I didn't want to pull that trigger until I really understood what would make the biggest impact with my skill set, with my background, with my passion. I think you have to align passion with skill set and where you can add the value. And once I sort of figured out that Venn diagram intersection, that's when I went forward and started Change Foods. So that was about, 3 years later. Well, in 2019, I technically founded it. We didn't really start doing the R&D until early 2020. But in 2019 is when I sort of finally made the decision of really loving a particular technology, which is precision fermentation, as it's now called, but more historically known as microbial fermentation, and also to gear it towards dairy and cheese products, which for so many reasons, which I can get into a little later. But really, once I made that connection, then I had to find the right co-founder. Sort of that came from that technology, of course, because I am aerospace background and I am a technical person, but I'm not a microbiotechnician, that's for sure. So I had to obviously go on the quest to find the best person I could in Australia at the time, of which I did. And then, of course, we started the R&D, and here we are today, a couple of years later. In saying that, though, once I started Food Frontier, I did move into the food industry, I guess, at large. I wanted to move out of aerospace just to wet my feet, I guess, and learn about how this industry operates. And I started another startup as a COO, a hemp foods company, actually, which, hemp foods was just legalized at the time, just the year before, earlier. And this was one of the first companies to sort of establish and build a brand around hemp foods in retail. So as the COO, I had to really figure out, how do I manufacture this? How do I create a supply chain around this? Pardon me. How do I, get it to shelves? How do I work with the retailers? How do I figure out all the margin pricing? How do I basically figure out the entire sort of supply chain and figure it out? And it was quite alarming to me. I mean, food is not aerospace, that's for sure. I learned that very quickly. But nonetheless, it was a really great stepping stone and transitional point. So I wanted to garner all the learnings that I could before I started my own thing as well, which was really helpful. And then I also helped a plant-based meat company in the US called Hungry Planet, which is a great arrangement of plant-based meat products and wonderful founders, which I grew a relationship with through Food Frontier, and wanted to really help them out expand into the APAC region, which was also a great opportunity for me to meet a lot of people, I guess, in the distribution network, travel to Singapore and Shanghai, and really sort of establish and figure out, once again, structurally, how can we increase, I guess, food distribution through the region. So that's, brought all of those learnings into Change Foods ultimately when I decided to make
your
that
appetite,
change.
It sounded like it.
Yes,
that
yes,
was
exactly.
Good experience. So a couple of things. How did you find your founder then? I mean, and what kind of background? Was he more of an academic kind of?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's a very technical endeavor. So maybe stepping back a little bit. So precision fermentation allows us to recreate bioidentical dairy compounds, which are, whichever compound you're looking for. And for cheese, and in particular, and dairy at large, protein is critical. There's something very unique about dairy proteins that you can't sufficiently replicate from the plant-based world. And so there is some, this is the benefit of why using what's called precision fermentation can be so effective. We can produce bioidentical dairy, proteins, but not from a cow. It's quite amazing. And so we're using microorganisms in lieu of an actual macroorganism or a cow or an animal, which is really efficient. Effectively, we take a microorganism, we can insert the same gene that you would find from a cow into the microorganism as part of its genetic material and DNA. So then when it ferments and does its thing, as you would with beer fermentation, you could effectively take the same sort of yeast, but give it some of the genetic material from a cow. And as it's fermenting, it can produce that bioidentical protein that we can then purify away and then use in food formulation. So that's what it is. Very technical. And of course, had to really look at sort of saying, well, who are the best academics and professors that might have a history on the particular organisms that I already researched that could be quite useful in this space. It led me to find a pioneer in fungal biogenetics from Macquarie University, Professor Helena Nevalainen. She just retired from the university, so I wrote out to her because I read a lot of her papers and reports, which I stumbled across, and she's been very active in the space since the 1970s, originally from Finland. And so I reached out to her, and she just retired. Once again, she said, she'd love to help out and stay on the advisory board. But he's my colleague that I've worked with for over 20 years in the particular organisms you're looking with. He's up at the Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, Associate Professor Junior Teo. You should speak to him. And that's where it all started. I sent him a great email. Me and Sasha Baker, the VP and Chief of Staff at Change Foods, we flew up to visit Junior in his lab in 2019. We took him out for a plant-based burger, his first one, and he was like, wow, he was pretty impressed by it, but has been very driven by sustainability for his over 20 plus years academic career as a professor in microbial biotech, and he knew exactly how he could help. He knew how we could take this and start the process of creating dairy proteins within microbes.
Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. So how long, I mean, like you mentioned about reading some of these papers, and I get your engineering mindset and background. How much does it take you? I mean, clearly, I suppose your journey for the last few years has been an R&D journey, really, right? So
that's right.
How, it's some steep learning curve, right? I mean,
there is. I mean, I've learned more about biotech than I could have ever imagined. I think I've done a degree just through practice and just being in the space, obviously. But look, there's different startups for different people. I've always been the type that once I learn or want to do something, I do it hard. I learn a lot, and I've got a lot of interests that span from history, and I can deep dive into civilizations, and I can deep dive into this. It's just who I am. It's my nature, I guess. And so this was just normal to me to sort of really deep dive as much as I could possibly, theoretically at least, understand the science, but enough to make sound decision making from, which as the CEO, that's all I really needed. Do I need to know how to actually get in the lab and do it? No, I don't, but I need to know the key risks, the key factors. And so it was a huge learning experience for me. But I also worked very closely with Junior on obviously coming up to speed and really cracking down and learning the process, and continue to absorb and learn over time, which has been fascinating. But look, I mean, it's not for everyone. Some people don't have that proclivity, and but doesn't mean that you still can't start. I mean, I started a very technical company, but there's plant-based companies, there's companies which, you can start if you're that way inclined and want to start a company that can fit your personality and characteristics. So, in my case, I wanted to go and really use a technology that had a big impact and a big potential, even if it meant I was even happy to do. I'm happy to go back and do a PhD if that's what it takes. But I knew that I wanted to get into this space.
Yeah, no, great. So tell me a little bit more about the markets, that you want to go after, and the kind of products ultimately you want to make.
Yeah. So really, when I looked at the limitations within cheese and dairy, first of all, there's a huge gap, right? So I think meat products, I could see there's this rise of plant-based meats occurring, with the likes of probably some of the best products being Hungry Planet, being Impossible Foods, being Beyond Meat, that people sort of now know about. They've done a great job at investing a lot of R&D, taking, I guess, what we call first generation mock meat products out of Buddhist areas like Taiwan and China, and really reinventing them and bringing them, using the latest technology to sort of say, well, look, they've got a platform of how they've mimicked some of the aspects of texture, but how do we now improve on taste using the best of technology and devices that we have available? And this sort of really started, I guess, in the early 2000s as what we call second and third generation plant-based meats. And of course, now we've got products which are really actually quite remarkable, I think. If you look at the Impossible Burger, it bleeds, it changes color as you cook it. It does all the things and gives you all the sensory satisfaction that you'd expect from a meat product. Of course, with certain applications, some are better than others. But nonetheless, I could see how the gap is actually quite small now, and it will only continue to improve with more and more R&D and more companies working into solving these issues. So that really excited me. But when you look at plant-based dairy and cheese, there is not that same level of mimicry, if you like. And so there's this clear functional gap, especially when you look at the harder style cheeses like a cheddar, or even a very highly functional cheese like a mozzarella on pizza. You're looking for that stretch, you're looking for that melt, you're looking for those cheesy dairy notes. And of course, plant-based cheeses have come a long way, and there's some great companies doing lots of great things with nut fermentation. And I think for certain types of cheeses, it's fantastic. I'm a big consumer of them. But how is this going to crack into the mass market dairy consumer, the hardcore cheese lover? And I think that is where the technology fails. And that's just my belief. I've been plant-based for a while, but I come to know that the mass consumer is definitely not there and not convinced by the standard of these products. When I speak to everyone in my friends and family, my circles outside of my little bubble, it's very clear very quickly that the standard of the products doesn't cut it. So first of all, I identified cheese as the biggest gap, where this technology can be geared and aimed towards to solve that particular problem. And then within cheese, obviously starting with the low-hanging fruit, I guess, from a market consumption point of view, which is cheddar and mozzarella. They're by far the most widely consumed cheases worldwide, especially because of pizza.
Right. I thought it
mozzarella,
was an English thing.
yeah.
I thought cheddar was an English thing. I didn't realize.
Oh, if you're in England, maybe. But globally, mozzarella is the most consumed cheese. And I think, once again, because of pizza, because the application and the size or the volume of cheese that you need for pizza is quite a lot for cheese. And so really it's like, once again, driven by impact, driven by consumer demands, and also what this technology can solve for. The clear obvious winners are mozzarella and cheddar. Start with there, or burger cheese, if you like, or sort of American style cheese. And of course, the American market was strategically where we wanted to aim towards to start with, because that's where there's the biggest consumer adoption of these products. And of course, in the market size that can justify economically, at least, and counterbalance some of the fundraising that we have to raise in this space. So, we do have to raise in the hundreds of millions of dollars to scale biotechnology. That's the reality of this industry. And so, once again, how do we sort of get to market? How do we create a revenue stream? And just all the typical sort of startup economic sort of factors came into play, which identified the US as an obvious starting point for us in a market that is already sort of has a strong adoption of these products, certainly in California at least. And so that's why we started here. That's
why you're over there now, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, it makes perfect sense, basically.
Exactly.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah. No, that's great. Tell me, you were saying before, because I'm not that familiar with the current landscapes. You said, I've heard of some companies like Kite Hill, for instance, and
right.
That have been on the trail for the last few years. What works well with the alternative cheese, alternative protein space with cheese at the moment, for instance, and where is the gap?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great companies doing great things. And once again, I think when you start looking at the softer style cheeses, yogurts, companies are doing a fairly good job, like Kite Hill. I actually consume their yogurts. They're pretty good. But there is still, once again, a gap at the top end in sort of the mozzarellas and cheddars, the functional cheeses. And look, there's people that still, I mean, it's still a rising category. I mean, it's 65% growth over the last 5 years for just plant-based cheeses alone. So it's a growing category just because people are more, wanting to either change their diets for health, they're more flexitarian reasons, or trying to reduce meat consumption. They're trying to incorporate more plant-based options in their diet. Fantastic. We need those products and they're doing a great job. But when we start looking at for early adopters, the sort of first 15% of the innovation diffusion curve of the market, that can work. How do you get to the 20th percentile of the market? How do you get to 50th percentile of the mass market, the early mass market, the late mass market? That's a different challenge. And I think that's really where we need a different technology. We need a different solution. We need a different tool, of which I believe this tool is it. I think this can actually solve for the gaps. You can create bioidentical cheese. I mean, you have a yes, it's a cheese analog in some ways, at least initially, just because of the cost challenges with this technology. So it may have to be a hybrid of sort of some plant-based cheese, but with just the addition of these bioidentical proteins, you're adding the nutrition back. You still don't have the lactose, you don't have the cholesterol, you don't have the issues and downsides of cheese, but you're adding in what's lacking, right? Which is the protein. You have the nutritional equivalency, and you have the functionality, you have the melt, you have the stretch, you have the texture, you have the taste. All of that comes back with the addition of this one key product of casein, and so that's really where I think it was big gap, big market opportunity, one product, one focal product that can unlock that potential. Is casein easy to produce? No, it's a technical challenge. That's where the barrier comes into play. But I love that challenge. I love solving a big problem using technology. That's just in my DNA. Right. So, I like the challenge. We're up for the challenge, as we all are within Change Foods, and we can see, and we're achieving it. I mean, we've produced it. Now it's just how do we scale? How do we come down the cost as aggressively as possible and get it to market and figure out to start a new category of foods? I think that's tremendously exciting. But look, there's great companies out there. There is other companies in our space, obviously, as well. We've got direct competition in different markets in the US, but we all are slightly focused on a different product or a different technique. I mean, we're very laser focused on casein, number one. Other companies are more sort of holistically looking at dairy or milk, or but I would argue that cheese is where we want to start. I think that's where the biggest gap is. That's where the premium is in the market. That's where the biggest functional gap is. And then we're going to start with cheese and then broaden to other dairy in future. Whereas a lot of other companies are sort of looking at dairy more holistically from the start, right. So focused on a few other things.
No, great. Sounds very exciting. And just tell me again about casein. Well, what is it specifically about casein which is so valuable and so complicated in scaling?
Yeah, well, it's a mammalian protein, number one. So it's very difficult to figure out how to get an equivalent protein in the plant-based world. It's a structural protein. So within milk, you have whey proteins, you've got casein proteins. In milk, they actually exist as something called a micelle, which is there's two analogies. You can use an egg or you can use a tennis ball. I like to use a tennis ball. So the micelle within milk, if you got a microscope and zoomed all the way into milk, you'd find these casein micelles, which are very small caseins. And they've evolved through lactation, I guess, ultimately, as this structure, which has 4 caseins, ultimately, sub-caseins, which make up the micelle. The tennis ball, the fuzzy hair on the tennis ball, is what allows it to suspend itself in liquid milk, and that's called kappa casein. It's a hydrophilic casein, which therefore bonds with water, which allows the micelle to float around within the milk. And then inside the tennis ball, or the egg, if you like, it's made up of 3 hydrophobic caseins, alpha S1, beta casein, alpha S2. And they effectively are released once you start looking at cheese making. So when you add a particular enzyme in milk, the enzyme typically is from a calf stomach, it's called rennet. They've now synthetically made it using our technology, surprisingly, since the early 1990s. So 90% of cheeses made worldwide today are made using non-animal rennet, which is made via precision fermentation since the 90s. And no one really knows that, but it's like, well, yeah, we're using the exact same technology that's already in cheese. We're extending that now to the macronutrients of proteins. But when you add the rennet to the milk, it basically shaves the tennis ball, if you like. So it cuts the hairs off the kappa casein. So it no longer is hydrophilic, and thereby releases the hydrophobic caseins, or basically it sort of denatures the casein in the cell, and all of the hydrophobic caseins all clump together, which form the curd. So when you hear about curds and whey, the curd is effectively therefore all casein. The whey is the residual fluid in the milk, which is the whey protein. And so depending on your cheese that you're targeting, if it's a softer cheese like a ricotta, then you're obviously going to keep some of that whey within the matrix, within the cheese itself. And that's why for the softer cheeses, they're not as influenced just by casein. They also need some of the whey proteins, which is why you are seeing some great spreadable, beautiful plant-based soft cheeses like cream cheeses and ricottas, because whey does play a bigger role in that particular cheese. But the more you mature the curd, the more you ripen the curd and age the curd, like in a cheddaring process, over say 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, then of course you're looking to squeeze and remove as much of the whey as possible. And therefore you're just left with the fats in dairy and the casein. So ultimately that's what casein is, and that's why it's so important to try and recreate it.
Great. No, thank you for that. And what about scaling it? Like in terms of where you are, you said you've made product now, right? What kind of product have you made, and then how do you scale it from here?
Yeah, so I mean, we're focused on two of those caseins that I just referred to, which are the most prevalent in a cheese curd. And we've successfully produced them at lab scale, but also including some larger scales up to 1,000 liters in terms of fermenters. So when we talk about scale, we're talking about the fermenter itself. Yeah. When we talk about lab scale fermenters, we're talking around 5 to 10 liter fermenters that sit in the benchtop, and you can do your thing in the lab. And so this obviously this process whereby you start in very small volumes, in like shake flasks and tiny tubes, and eventually you bring up to a 1 liter fermenter, you go to a 5, you go to a 10, you go to 100, you go to 1,000, you go to 100,000, right? It's that sort of transition in biotech that you need to accomplish. And each step of the way, each time you scale up, it imparts new type of challenges. It's a different fermenter. The microorganisms are living beings to some respect, and therefore have their own temperament. So you do need to precisely do a lot of experimentation and optimization at each step of the process. And so we're working with a scale-up partner right now. We're scaling up in food grade fermentation capacity up to very large industrial size fermenters for two reasons. One is to prove the scalable process and make sure that we actually have a cost-efficient process that will lend itself to commercial viability. Because the one thing is you can do something in the lab scale, but can you actually scale it for food? It's a very different question. And so you do have to figure out, how do you optimize the DSP, the downstream processing? How do you optimize the fermentation conditions to actually make it viable for food? And so that takes a lot of testing and work. And that's why we're very aggressive on the scale up, to learn all these lessons quickly and change our process as quickly as we can to then optimize it. So we've done that. And also the second part of it is to actually produce enough product so we can use in our formulation trials and cheese trials. So we've closed a pretty large round of seed funding earlier this year, and we brought on board three actually wonderful strategic food companies, global food companies on board, who invested, but also we're collaborating with on those cheese making formulations and elements. So very exciting, and that's sort of where we're at right now, and that's what we're focused on over the next 6 months. So one of the companies is Upfield, and Upfield is the owner of the brand Violife cheese in the US. And so if you are a plant-based cheese consumer in the US, you will absolutely know Violife. It's sort of the #1 growing brand in the US, in all retail locations across North America, and have really great products. But even then, they realize the limitation of their own plant-based products, and I think they're super excited to get access to this technology to sort of look at taking plant-based cheeses to the next level in the future. And they see this as the future iteration of dairy and cheese as we know it. And on the other hand, we've got a traditional dairy and meat company, which is Sigma Foods in Mexico, who are also the exclusive manufacturers for Yoplait, for example, in Mexico. They make Hispanic cheeses very, very well, and have been doing so for many decades. And so we're working with both. And I think, it's great to see that on one end of the spectrum, dairy companies are super excited and fascinated to get hold of this. And then on the other end of the spectrum, plant-based companies are very excited to sort of improve their products as well. And so this is where it's a tremendous fit for sort of all types of food companies and ingredient companies and the like, worldwide as well.
Oh, sounds very exciting. Tell me about the bigger vision, in terms of, from where you are now, what's the big dream in terms of what you can achieve with this technology and this.
Yeah, gosh, the technology itself is transformational. It's revolutionary. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the cost of sequencing a human genome in 2001, it cost $100 million. Today, you can spit in a tube, send it off, get it back a couple of weeks later, and it's $1,000 or less even, actually. That's the type of shift that we're seeing these days. What does that mean for biotech? Well, it means that we can optimize things much more quickly, where we can do things at a pace that have never been, it's unprecedented in the past, and therefore we can optimize far quicker. There's all these converging technologies in computer science and AI and all of these things which are filtering now into biotech. And I just love that. I love the convergence of technologies and the fusion of technologies from different industries. That's why I'm so passionate about how aerospace can actually play a big role in food. It's bizarre, but it's true. Aerospace, we looked at looking at all of these exotic, high R&D, expensive materials and carbon composite fibers, and the whole plight of aerospace is, how do you scale that exotic material? How do you make it affordable so it actually is economical in a finished product? How do you create a manufacturing line about it, and how do you commercialize it in a very highly regulated industry with cutthroat margins? So aerospace has a lot of learnings in that paradigm that is now, in my mind, is what allows us now to use that same process and methodology in food, because this is the same thing. It's very expensive, high technology, high R&D innovation ingredients. How do we scale them? How do we bring them down the cost curve? How do we create a commercial supply chain around it? And regulation wise, what do we have to do to regulate it? What do we, there's all these sort of challenges we have to consider as part of that process. And that systemic approach is really what's needed. So it's revolutionary technology. It's going to not only revolutionize food, and because of that converging, all these converging forces, the cost is what's allowing it now to start being viable for food production and macronutrients, whereas in the past it's been far too expensive. So it's really, when you look at industrial biotech, it's mainly being geared and built around pharmaceuticals, high value food ingredients, the likes of non-animal rennet, as I talked about before, in cheese making, just because you need such a small quantity of it. So for high value ingredients, it's worked. In fact, all insulin today to treat diabetes is made by this technology, right? So they used to get it from pigs. Now it's produced synthetically using biotech. And there's a whole number of examples of where it's used pharmaceutically, medically, and for high value food ingredients. And so what does that mean? Well, because we've come down the cost curve so significantly, exponentially actually, and we'll continue to do so over the next few years and decades, then the opportunity for application just increases exponentially as well on the other end, right? So you'll start seeing it being used in food products, and you'll start seeing biomaterials, which really excites me as well. There's companies displacing palm oil using this technology as well. So you're seeing it in fats, you're using it for spider silk, you're using it for all types of these incredible applications, which, leather, collagen production, you'll see it in cosmetics, you'll see it really disrupting a lot of industries. And that's why it's so revolutionary as a technology. It's infinite in its potential because you're looking at the small, the invisible, the microbe, which is what excites me the most, actually. So it's what I call the second domestication. The first domestication is of animals. The second domestication is of microbes, microorganisms. How do we use the invisible as a factory to fuel consumption, which is infinitely scalable, because you can scale a bacterial culture within 20 minutes. It can double its population, right? So you don't have to raise a cow for 2 to 3 years, feed it bathtubs of water and land and feedstock, and it's burping and spitting out methane and doing all of its things as an animal does. You can skip all that. Really, when you look at then from a very draconian industrial point of view, a cow is just a metabolizer of feedstock. You give it food, it produces something for you. The rest of it is actually considered waste. From an engineering lens, everything else is waste. The skin is the waste, the cartilage is the waste, all of the part of that's waste. And so of course you have to have a leather industry. Of course you have to have a whey protein industry and stick it into every smoothie and shake and sell it as, whey proteins for muscle building. That's just because they're trying to profitize from the waste. Let's be real here. That's the only reason why this industry is profitable, because First of all, it's highly subsidized from the government. Second of all, you can only make it profitable by selling off the waste into creating revenue streams from the waste of this animal. So how do we take the most efficient metabolizer rather than a macroorganism?
Yeah.
How do we take that same process and boil it down to something that is ultimately the same process, but vastly more efficient, which of course is a cell. Like you can't beat that, right? Like you're giving it feedstock and you can produce casein. That's it. There's no milk, there's no whey, there's no bones, there's no cartilage, there's no gas, there's no methane, there's no tons of food that you have to feed this thing. There's no burning down the Amazon for soy, for cattle production. All of that goes away. So, I mean, it's really transformational fundamentally in terms of its power and potential. And that's what excited me the most. What does it mean for change foods? Well, we're just on that journey, right? So cheese and dairy, we could easily just be a cheese company alone and would be good for 30 years. I mean, cheese is widely consumed. It's a growth industry, second highest growth category within dairy. It's not going anywhere. People are consuming more and more of it. And the dairy industry is doing a great job at squeezing it into every possible thing you can imagine, including the crusts of pizza and now on dumplings in China. And it's going everywhere. So, it's how do we displace that using a much more far powerful and more efficient way to produce the same end product.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much. And look, David, I could chat to you all day about this.
Yeah.
And, just really appreciate you coming on, sharing your personal journey, the journey, for change foods. And, it's a great look at the kind of technology and, understanding around the kind of impact you're having. So listen, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Simon. Thank you so much.